Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm even happier to see you being here. Thanks, Rika, for clear words. That is my intention today. We will talk about things that matter, and we will not try to just have another debate without any result. In that context, it sort of worries me to see you here, because I realize very quickly that most of you are younger than me, which can mean two things. One is I'm getting old. The other is a lot of senior staff is not here. And maybe there's people we would like to see here, listen to this, that prefer not to. So let me just very quickly introduce the day today. We will have a very short introduction to climate change and mitigation, which is the major issue at the moment. That will be just 15 minutes of me speaking. After that, we'll have a very exciting panel with three very exciting people who are really the experts to answer your questions on a number of topics. So thank you for attending. Before we start, we have prepared two TED questions for you. You have probably seen that there is some device on your seats. Looks like this. You only have to bother, I was told it's idiot-proof because I had troubles at first sight, but it's just the last three bottoms that are relevant. We have question 1 here in German and English, and I would like to ask you to pick one answer here and to then press 1, 2, or 3. The question is, who should be the main responsible for taking action on climate change? You can only pick one answer, and that is governments, answer number 1. Tourism industry, answer number 2, through voluntary commitments then. And answer number 3 is the individual. That means all of us in our respective roles as travelers. Could you please all decide on one option right now? Thank you. It's the age of judgment, as you know. We'll come back to this later. There's a second question, if we could please. Oh, here's the result already. Fantastic. 50% think it's governments. That is exciting. 36% think it's tourists, and only 14% think that industry itself is either capable or willing to take action. That is a notable result. We'll come back to that later. Question number 2 then, please. The question is, how should climate change preferably be limited to stay within safe guardrails? Safe guardrails being defined as the level of climate change that humanity can cope with without our socio-economic and environmental systems being compromised. Would you think that answer number 1 is the right one? Global emission trading scheme. You know that the EU ETS, the European trading scheme, is already working. Should that system be global? Is that the solution? Number 2, should we have an energy or CO2 tax that makes energy-intense consumption so expensive that people will reduce their consumption of energy and then also corresponding emissions of CO2? Or is number 3 correct? Incentives to develop and introduce new low-carbon technology. In other words, is our future in technology, and can we rely on that? Please submit your answer now. And technology is the winner. Interesting. And how convenient, because it doesn't force anyone to change anything, right? I'm quite excited, however, to see that answer number 2, an energy CO2 tax, which I personally would have thought is quite controversial and less popular, has almost equally many votes, 40%, and only 18% of you seem to think that a global emission trading scheme is the right answer to climate change. Well, we'll try to develop your knowledge in the next 15 minutes. I have a presentation now coming up. If you would please, that is our panel in a few minutes. I'll very shortly talk about climate change, tourism mitigation, to give you some kind of understanding where we are standing at the moment and to give you some background. This is a recent publication from Munich Re. You probably know that it's the world's largest reinsurance company. And as you can imagine, as such, Munich Re is much concerned with climate change and the cost of climate change. This is a map of global events that are either meteorological, hydrological, or climatological in character, as well as geophysical, which is not directly related to climate change. And you can see worldwide we have seen a great number of such events. What is more relevant to you is, however, this picture, which shows the development over time in such events from the 80s up to now, to last year. And you can see that there is no change in geophysical events. These are quite constant. However, there's a remarkable increase in meteorological events, in particular storms, floodings, and extreme temperatures, droughts, and wildfires, which have increased massively over the last 30 years. Obviously, there's a cost connected to this, and obviously there are repercussions for the tourism system. Two of the most relevant changes for tourism are probably, first of all, skiing. You all have seen pictures like this. I just heard from the Black Forest that they have probably had one of the worst years ever in skiing history, which is sort of unfortunate because they invested huge amounts of money in both parking areas and new ski lifts. And they are, I presume, a bit puzzled about current developments. And the second thing that is relevant from the studies that we know is the change in rainfall patterns, rainfall frequencies, and rainfall distribution. This is a picture I took a few years ago in Barbados. You probably know that many small islands are depending on a stable climate. They are sun, sand, and sea destinations. And if you are taking a holiday in a tropical rain period, then it's not much of a pleasure. We even did one study in Martinique that told us that in such a period of rains, in what is anticipated to be the dry season, more than 10% of the respondents said they would never return to Martinique in this case. So there is a real danger, in particular with rainfall patterns and the frequency and intensity of rainfall in the future. So these are just two examples of the very complex implications that climate change will have for tourism. And our question is thus not whether we want to stabilize the climate system, it's a question of how to. Our global governance system depends on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which has the goal to stabilize the climate at a level that is not interfering with the climate system. And that is defined as a 2 degrees Celsius maximum warming compared to pre-industrialized levels. Now, mitigation then is put in particular on developed countries, because developed countries have the highest per capita emissions. In Germany, for instance, we emit 11 tons of carbon dioxide per capita per year on average. So there is a commitment then from different countries to engage in mitigation, and this is negotiated in the so-called conferences of parties, which are the guiding implementation events where we just saw the Paris Agreement as the major breakthrough in global climate negotiations after Kyoto in 1997, I might say. So the question is now, are we on track with the Paris Agreement to achieve significant reductions in greenhouse gases? And as you know, Paris will not take effect before 2020. So before anything changes, it'll be another 5 years. The second thing is that the commitments that have been submitted to UNFCCC at the moment would lead to global emission growth to 55 gigatons of CO2 per year. Currently, we are at a level of 40 gigatons per year. by 2030. So in other words, if the countries really implement the pledges they have made at the moment, then emissions will not decline, they will further continue to 55 gigatons. If tightened Paris Agreement negotiations take place, we might be able to stabilize global emissions of greenhouse gases. In other words, then we would stay at 40 gigatons by 2030. The problem, both are incompatible with 2 degrees Celsius objective. And you might also know that 105 out of 190 countries even asked for a different objective, which is just 1.5% global warming. And this we might reach as soon as 2020, the year the Paris Agreement will start to kick in the first place. So you can understand from this, we have a huge problem here. And obviously the question is, how relevant is tourism in this? This is the official kind of calculation that is still valid at the moment. It is what the UNWTO has published in cooperation with the United Nations Environment Programme. And you can see that this calculation puts tourism at 5% of global emissions in the year 2005. Most people would say, why are we even talking about this? 5% is nothing. And in this report, it also reads, tourism emissions are non-negligible, which is a very interesting political formulation, if you ask me. What is non-negligible? It's somehow relevant, we should talk about it, but on the other hand, perhaps not. So let me give you a slightly different understanding of non-negligible here. The first thing that you have to consider is that aviation is the most important contributor to emissions of greenhouse gases from tourism, and aviation is only used by 3% of the world's population. In other words, 97% of the world's population at this point do not participate in international air travel in a given year. We are talking about elite activities. Secondly, individual holidays can exceed sustainable per capita emissions. And what does that mean? That means simply, at the moment, we have per capita emissions in the order of 4.5 tons per capita per year on global average. A sustainable level of emissions would be in the order of 3.5 tons of carbon dioxide up to 2020. A single journey by air, that's only the flight to Australia, can, however, already cause emissions of more than 12 tons of carbon dioxide, measured as the warming impact of this journey. And I thought I should also give you, since we are talking provocatively these days, or today anyway, this is what a journey from Germany to the Seychelles would cause, to the Maldives, which is 5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, if you want. So we have a huge problem here in terms of how individual journeys contribute to climate change, and even sadder insight perhaps is that cruise tourism is even a greater problem in terms of emissions. So Paul Peeters, who's on the panel here today, and I did a calculation on how tourism has been developing emission-wise and how it will develop in the future. And you can see in this graph that the growth is quite substantial. Here we are in 2010, and you can see that up to about 2035, emissions from the global tourism system will double. This is a scenario that takes already into account technological improvements. So what you also see is that aviation, the light blue part here, is the major contributor, and its share will grow. Second is accommodation, and then third is car traffic. So we have a situation where tourism is in a decarbonization dilemma. Global CO2 emissions need to decline by 40 to 70% by 2050, yet emissions from tourism are expected to grow by 170% over this period of time. Now, a more specific look at aviation tells us some other things. You might have seen this graph. It's quite interesting to see that for aviation, we always have a worst case scenario. which is sort of, if we did nothing, we would end up here. And then you have a second scenario, or secondary scenarios that would tell us how much we could deviate from this worst case scenario if technology, operational measures, infrastructure measures, and additional technologies and biofuels came into play. And this looks quite good. By 2050, aviation would manage to emit half of what it does today. The question is this a realistic scenario, and is this the whole truth? Paul has done some calculations here. First of all, the expectation that we have for aviation to grow in emissions is different. It's this red line, so it's quite considerably more than industry itself says. And secondly, if you put this in relation to the IPCC recommendation, you can see that what we would have to reduce in terms of emissions is considerably more than even in the best case scenario that is presented by aviation. So in other words, we have a slight problem here, and this can also be expressed in this graph, where we have technology improvements in terms of fuel use, and you can see, yes, it's correct. Aviation has become ever more fuel efficient in the past, considerably so. However, due to the strong growth in the sector, we have a different scenario when it comes to observed emission growth, and that is in right contrast to those specific emission reductions that we have for every kilometer that is flown. So in other words, the most important sector in terms of emissions is also the most problematic one in terms of mitigation. How do we deal with that? To come back to our TED questions, I think it's fair to say we need very significant change in the global tourism system. Current energy prices, as you know, are too low to initiate any change. To the contrary, energy is now cheaper at the moment than at least for a 10-year period. And you also know there is nothing implemented at the moment that would significantly increase the price of fuel. There's actually only one exception, which is the air passenger duty that the UK has introduced. So there is very little evidence of change because of either higher prices and hence individual traveler behavior change. And there's also very little evidence that industry itself, by voluntary commitments, can change the system. With this, I would like to open up for debate. We have another third TED question here, which I hope we can bring up here. And it's a bit easier. The question in this case is very specific. I would like to know the share of you who think that international air travel should be exempt of fuel duties and VAT, even in the future, because that is the case at the moment. Do you agree with that, or do you disagree? If you agree, please press 1 now. And if you disagree, then please press 2. Mm-hmm. 15% are in favor of the current system, meaning no CO2 tax or any other duty on aviation. And 85% of you think that there should be a duty for international air travel in order to increase the price of emissions and energy use. Thank you very much. We now turn to the panel. I have 3 fantastic guests. Mr. Musa Samir Hassan from the Maldives. Will you please come up and take the second chair here? Then we have Andreas Koch, blueContec Consulting. And last not least, Paul Peeters, an aircraft engineer and now working for ICAO on the fuel emission standard. Thank you very much for coming here today. I have prepared 2 questions for each of you before we open to the panel. Perhaps we could start with those questions, go back to my presentation. They are in the next slide. And then I can start posing a question to Mr. Hassan. Could you please go back to my presentation? I guess that's easier. Yes, thank you. I told you it's hardball today, so this is a question that some people might consider unfair. I would like to know, the Maldives are one of the countries which will be severely affected by climate change, but as I illustrated, the tourism system that the Maldives has and is depending on for 75% of its GDP, if I'm correctly informed, is also a major contributor to climate change. How should we look at that paradox? Is there anything that could be done in the future to address this? Mr. Samir.
First of all, thank you very much. Let me say that Maldives is partnering with ITB this year. Obviously, because we want to continue to have a good growth in tourist arrivals, and especially from Germany. Germany is #1 European market for the Maldives. That's why we are partnering with ITB, and Maldives is celebrating its Visit Maldives year, 2016. So definitely, as a policy, Maldives is inviting more people to come and enjoy their holiday in the Maldives. Maldives is a sun, sea, and sand destination. And it has attracted so far the Europeans as the major market. And in the recent times, we have been having the Chinese arrivals there, which is leading the market now. Now, your question about increasing the tourist arrivals, whilst we are also challenged by the climate change impacts. Small islands, I'm sure you are all very familiar. Maldives is one very vulnerable island nation. It is affected by the global economic impacts. It's affected by this global climate change impacts. It's affected by the globalization. You might have heard, we are also transforming into a democratic country and so forth. We have so many challenges. Now then, the sustainability issue and of tourism in terms of arrivals increasing, I think whether tourists arrive or not, Maldives will be impacted by climate change. We are already impacted by climate change. We have very dynamic beaches. That's the resource that we have. The natural environment, that's the natural base. Look at how the beaches just so dynamically change over the during the seasons. You might have a water villa one time, and the next day or in the next season, that water villa is on the beach. So we have a very dynamic situation where islands are actually being moved within the lagoon itself. Now then, we also have the challenge because of the increase in climate change and the temperature that we might be submerged, or the sea level rise could be a big threat to the island nation. So whether we like it or not, whether we have tourism or not, this is actually the real situation. Now, we as a people have to survive. We have to do what we have to do. So we are inviting people. We are bringing in the tourists with this, of course, knowing the challenge that, as you mentioned, the transportation is one big challenge because this aviation sector is contributing to the climate situation. Now then, what can the islands such as Maldives do? Our tourism, I think, is one very premium destination. We try to portray ourselves as one exemplar eco-marine destination. So we have good international tourism operators, chains working in the Maldives. They have a global responsibility. We can put forth those regulatory mechanisms in place to ensure that the kind of high-end products that we have are sustainable, are meeting the international standards, and are responsible. I think this is the way forward. And for the Maldives, we don't have a choice. We cannot, tourism now contributes. Mind you, I have to correct you, it's not 70%, but it's something like 30% contribution to the GDP. Okay. So, well, it is significant. Maldives cannot really, that means, survive without tourism. And all the other economic activities have come about because of tourism. The transportation in the Maldives, you know, it takes maybe a month to go from the north to the south. It might take, I mean, if you go on the sail, in a sailing boat, how long would you want to travel to your city, you know? But then we have to make a decision. Yes, we have the largest, in fact, the globally largest seaplane operation now in the Maldives. And that contributes to carbon emissions. So what we have planned from the government is that we will have a carbon neutral policy where we are going to, in a longer term, become a carbon neutral country. Now, that was one commitment that the Maldives have made. So that's something really good. I think that is one thing that, you know, is a small nation, I think with a very good tourism industry, I think very positively and think can do, in fact. And another aspect is that we have this extensive coral reef system. Maldives is an archipelagic nation from north to south lying on the equator and has the wonderful you know, growth in coral formations and biodiversity, one of the richest. And well, Germans love to do the scuba diving there. So we don't want to avoid that. We want people to come enjoy the reefs, but then what can the Maldives do? What we are doing is we are trying to conserve the richness of the biodiversity and the coral ecosystem. I tell you, the impact from climate change is such that, you know, when we had the El Nino, we had a vast majority of our reefs bleached. We didn't do a thing. It has happened. So what do? So we try to protect as much reefs as possible for conservation, and we have established one of the best natural atoll in the Maldives as a UNESCO established biosphere reserve in Ba Atoll. Somebody just mentioned about one island in Ba Atoll. I think it was you, probably just now when we met. So Ba Atoll is now a well-known whale shark and manta ray, you know, globally significant biosphere reserve. So we have one whole atoll being established there. And moving forward, Maldives has now again started to work to establish the entire national biosphere reserve. Isn't that something good? Okay, I think...
Most definitely.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we have heard that you said something almost in a bracket, but I think it's quite significant. You said that you want to be a carbon neutral destination in the future. I hope to take this up next year because I think that is a very significant part of the future. We know that we can solve the issue with technology, so other measures have to take place, and one of them might be carbon offsetting. We'll come back to that. Let me move to our second panelist here. Andreas, you work with hotels. Hotels are the second most relevant sector when it comes to emissions from tourism. Is there something we can do, economically speaking, in order to make hotels less energy intense?
Well, there are many things you can do. I mean, you asked me also for the question if it's feasible. Is it working? If it's feasible to... Not working. It's going in and out, huh? Okay. If it's feasible for hotels. So I looked at the...
Can we get a new mic here, please? Ah, thank you. Thank you, Marie.
Shall I use this one? This is better, or? Good one, perfect. So if I look at the last 100 hotels I've been working with, well, there was one hotel where we couldn't find anything to save energy. 98 was about really a lot of things we... Wow.
It's almost like Donald Trump, huh?
Hello.
Can we try another one? Believe me, you want to hear what he's saying.
Okay, I try this one. Is this one working? Yeah. Good one, perfect. Okay, so interestingly, what we found in the last 100 hotels I was working with was that one actually couldn't save anything at all, and there were like 98 that could save a lot of things. Interestingly, out of that, most measures, 30% of the measures, were without investing. So that was very interesting that we found that. And 1/3 was with small payback times, 1 to 2 years, and only the 3% was about long-term investment. So I was really irritated by that. And the long answer is, actually, I found one hotel, and I found it very interesting, that produced more energy than it consumed. So I was taking this question a little bit further. So could we dream of really hotels that produce more than they consume? And looking at all the hotels I've been working with, interestingly, the oldest hotel is the most efficient one. And I was very curious about why this was the most efficient one. It was designed for environment. It is like 50 years old, and it's in a Maoric style. I don't know if you know the old Maoric style. The wind comes in, it goes through a pond, and it goes up to in the chimneys. So you can always see the small little chimneys, and it goes up. There is wind all over in this hotel, and they use no air conditioning at all in the whole building. I was very amazed by that. So when you look at the design of the new buildings, of any buildings like in any destination now, the new style is glasses to the south area, to the water, and there you have air conditioning. So one guy said, the worst that can happen to climate change is the invention of the air conditioning system, because no one cares how you build it. So we have to go back to this kind of way of building hotels and really have to explore all the options. And it's totally economically feasible. I've brought one figure, I looked at Hilton, they have a very interesting program, Light Stay, if you look at the website, so they control all the energy efficiency of 4,000 hotels, and they saved $74 million in 2010 on that. So it is feasible, and it's logic, and it's a logical way to do it. And by the way, it's number 3 cost block in every hotel. Besides human resource and all the products, it's number 3, even sometimes number 2 of the cost blocks of every hotel worldwide.
Thank you. Actually, Andreas is living proof of the economic feasibility of this system, because if I understand you correctly, blueContec is at least partially working on the basis of contracting, which means the hotel that works with Andreas won't even have to invest anything. They are paid in the first year's saving. So that is quite remarkable as a business model, and it should send a very clear message to hotel owners and managers in terms of what can be done to save on the bottom line. Moving on to Paul. There are big discussions ongoing at the moment. If I told you some of the things Paul has told me last night, he would probably be chased from the working group. There are some things ongoing that should be worrying for people who believe in democracy and in our supranational organizations. We are not going to touch on those because we want Paul to stay where he is. Paul, is ICAO's work on track to achieve emission reductions in aviation in line with the IPCC recommendation?
Yes, I will try to answer that question, but first of all, I'd like to slightly correct my position maybe. I'm paid by the university, NHTV, Breda, University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, so they pay me. The university is paid for me being a consultant, and that's paid by Transport and Environment. It's an NGO in Brussels. And those are involved in an international organization that's an observer at ICAO, at the negotiations about all sorts of measures in environmental issues. And because of I'm consulting for them, I'm a member of some working groups in ICAO, but certainly not paid by them. So what I say here is not on behalf of ICAO. Before we have that kind of misunderstandings, that would be a bit nasty probably. Then back to the question. ICAO is basically, with respect to climate change, doing 2 things. They call it the 2 pillars. And the first one is they are working on an efficiency, a fuel efficiency standard for new aircraft. So that means that new aircraft need to fulfill a certain requirement of fuel efficiency, and otherwise they cannot be produced. They do not get a type license, as it is called. So that's the first pillar, and the second pillar is market-based measures. and they basically are about offsetting a certain amount of emissions by aviation. Well, let's first go to the fuel efficiency standard. You've seen the graph that Stefan showed with the improvements of fuel efficiency of aircraft over the past 50, 60 years. And that's quite impressive, and that's certainly not because the aviation industry is so very environmentally conscious. It's just economics. If you want to sell an aircraft, then it must be economically feasible, and that means that every new generation of aircraft really needs to be 10–15% better than the last one it's replacing. Otherwise, there will be no interest from the airlines. That's one side of it, the economic side. There's also a technical reason. If you have a ship, for instance, you have lots of space in a ship, and if you add a little bit space, doesn't matter. So if you need more fuel and a little bit more weight, it doesn't matter, you make the ship a little bit bigger. In an aircraft, you have to lift the whole thing in the air, and everything is limited. Weight is limited, space is limited, you sit like this. That's not because they don't like you, but there is no other way to do it. So there are a lot of technical reasons that if you require less fuel, then you can have more passengers on board. It's as simple as that. If you have a lower maximum takeoff weight, you can use a shorter runway, so provide services to more airports in the world than your competitor is. So there are so many incentives, and then of course fuel cost, but that's actually the third. The other ones are more important, that drive always fuel efficiency to a better performance. And that means that it's very difficult to add something to that. And what ICAO tries to do now is to add an incentive, an additional incentive, by regulating a certain level of fuel efficiency. And then you are working in very narrow margins. So the margins are like, maybe for the next 20 years, you might shave off 5% of fuel overall, of fuel use for the whole aviation sector in 20 years. So that means about 1 or 2 years of growth in emissions by aviation. That's the compensation. You delay that by 1 or 2 years. And then we are at the same level as we would have been without such a standard. And then still, of course, there's a lot of politics. So every country that has an aircraft manufacturer, the United States with Boeing, Europe with Airbus, Canada with Bombardier and some others. And they all look at what are our factories doing with respect to this level of fuel efficiency. And they all have so their wishes. And so we ended up with something that actually in February it was decided that I think it will have no effect at all in the end. And we can talk about that later maybe.
We talked about the TED question, and a majority, as you remember, believe that we could resolve this by technology. I think Paul has made the case that technology will be important. It will help to achieve better efficiencies, but overall, in terms of absolute emission growth, it is not going to have the big role that we would like it to have. So that is certainly a big question mark that is in the room right now. With that, I'd like to open up for a number of questions from the auditorium. Please, when you're addressed, could you try to answer shortly that we can accommodate a number of questions. There we have a question right over there. Could we get a mic? Oh yeah, thank you.
First, I would like to thank. It's a very important and interesting panel. I would like to ask Mr. Hassan, because he spoke about the carbon neutral growth of the Maldives. How can this work if we include aviation? I would like to know what is your plan and how do you like to deal with it?
I think I did mention about increasing the reserves that we want to create in the country. That's one area where we want to create, it's not only emissions, but there are sinks, and then we have to protect those reserves. That's one very important. The reefs are very important for this as well. So this is one way of dealing with mitigation. And the other front, we are actually also converting and changing the existing infrastructure and facilities in tourist facilities. In terms of refrigeration and transportation, we have a maritime, we are a marine destination. So a lot of travel is also done by boats. Currently, we are using diesel as the main transportation fuel. So we are incorporating and trying to use, increasing the percentage of use of biofuels in maritime transport. So this is another way. So that means we are, from the current situation, we are going to increase the amount of biofuels and the renewable energy that we will be utilizing. Maldives has plenty of sunshine. So I'll tell you, now recently we have the world's first entire one island run on renewable energy. One tourist resort is entirely operated on renewable energy. So this is good news. This is something piloted and done now, and the others can follow suit. So I think there is plenty of room for that, and then we just need to lay out the, of course, it will take a while to see how much and what will be the cost of entire, making the Maldives carbon neutral, and we are working on it.
Thank you. Great. Another question? Don't be shy. You won't meet these people very soon again, and they are the ones to answer the questions. In the back.
Thank you. Can you hear this?
Okay.
Hello? How about this one?
That's much better.
Okay, so, the question about aircraft emissions, if the ICAO regulations are not going to have any impact, but the growth in global CO2 emissions from aviation are going to go up by 300% or something over the coming decades, what are the solutions for reducing emissions from aviation and aircraft emissions associated with tourism?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are no painless solutions, I'm afraid. That's the short answer. We could consider, of course, you could tax aviation so it grows. Its growth is a little bit less.
It's not finished?
Here it's back again. But there is a limit to it. The same model we used for the scenarios that Stefan showed is now developed further, and I'm now experimenting a little bit with taxes. And even if you tax aviation by 200% on a ticket, and I know about the political impossibility of such a proposition, but in a model you can do that. It's the easy thing of a model. And then still growing. It's not going down, certainly not. The other thing you could do from a kind of revolutionary technologies, that's another option, like open rotor engines, other configurations of aircraft, and they are quite often mentioned in the debate. But there are two things you must realize. First, that even the revolutions, they might shave off 20% of the emissions, so it's still not going down with the growth we envisage. The second thing is that it will take an enormous time to get the whole fleet to such a new technology. Developing the technology 2 decades before it's ready to safely fly you to the Maldives, that really will already take 20 years for many technologies like electric batteries that could indeed generate so much or save so much energy or contain so much energy as you need for an aircraft. But then you have to start the design of this completely new electric aircraft, which takes another. The 787 Dreamliner took 12 years from the idea to the aircraft that's now flying. And that's a pretty conventional one. There are new technologies in it, but not revolutionary. So 12 is the limit at the low side, but it's probably another 2 decades. Then you have the aircraft there. That's 40 years already. And then we start to introduce it into the fleet. So slowly the fleet will change to the new ones. And that's another 20 years before it will be really significant. So we are almost at the end of this century. And that's simply too late. So that's another thing. But you wanted answers to what will help. With the same model, I also built in a way to limit the capacity of the growth, the growth of the capacity of airports. And that, of course, is very effective. What happens then is that aviation becomes scarce because slots become scarce, and scarce slots in normal economics will become very expensive. So aviation becomes expensive, and you see a kind of crisis developing in the model in a couple of decades. And then the emissions, but also aviation goes down. So that would be probably bad news for the Maldives. They will require to, well, somehow modify the tourism market in a way that you need much less flights and earn much more money from each tourist that comes in.
That is a good proposition, perhaps at the end of this. Thank you all. I have to close this down now so that we stay in time. I think we've learned a number of very important things. We have learned that emission growth is an issue. We've learned that we will not resolve this by technology alone. We might be in for radical change, which might mean that we are not building a third runway at Heathrow, for instance, if I interpret you correctly. And it might also mean for destinations that they have to think about different models. This is a huge issue that we start to take up here. We'll not have time to finish this today, but I'll invite you already today for next year, and I hope many of you will attend again. Thank you for being here. The next slot that is coming up today is the National Geographic World Legacy Awards panel, and I would warmly invite you to stay even for this next upcoming event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.